today we're in for a treat. And I'm very happy to introduce someone who's not only a brilliant scholar, a beautiful human being, a brilliant athlete. I think that if I keep going, we'll have a conference call. I'll just start with Anjali's CV. Dr. Anjali Forber-Pratt. Dr. Forber-Pratt is an assistant professor at the Peabody College at Vanderbilt University. Before that, she got all her degrees from the University of Illinois at Champaign, a bachelor's, master's, Ph.D. And she's also a Paralympic athlete, world champion, Olympic medalist, Paralympic medalist. I mean, she's an all-around rock star, and someone I'm very, very happy to call my friend. And I have invited Dr. Forber-Pratt to join us this morning, mostly to have a conversation. So this is not super scripted. There is no script. There is no PowerPoints. It's just conversation. And I'll give you folks a little bit of context. This is part of an ongoing, I would say, 3-4 year conversation that hasn't ended between. No, because I mean, we have to just keep it going on between Anjali and myself. Every year now and then we talk about research. We have conversations in a car, driving around Nashville, and we talk all the time on Facebook and WhatsApp, and we share ideas about research. We have done some work together in that regard, and I said, well, you're someone who has navigated all this qualitative research today. And we talked a little about that. I said, well, I want you to come and just hang out for us for an hour, okay? Tell us a little bit more about your views on research, tell us about your background, tell us about, and maybe help these folks right here, students in first semester in the master's program, still trying to figure out what their thesis might look like. And right now they're totally clueless, they're totally dazed and confused, and they can use all the help they can get. I mean, you know what it's like. We were there before. We've been here. So, yeah, so without any further ado, the idea is that Dr. Forber-Pratt will share some things with us, and at some point when you feel like asking a question, all I ask you is to basically sit here or come as close as you can to the microphone and ask your questions. At any point, just get up and come and here to ask a question. Let's take that as an opportunity. And again, Anjali, thank you for taking time on a Saturday morning to hang out with us via Zoom. And of course, thank you, Colton, because he's going to be such a good boy, and we have to be ready for that. So I'm done talking. Anjali, we're all yours.
Excellent. Well, I'm really excited to spend a little bit of time here with you this morning, and really, like Raul said, I want this to be a conversation. I want it to be helpful for you all as you're, starting to make some decisions around what it is that you're wanting to research and so forth. I think a little bit of background, and I'm not positive how much you know about some of the work that I've done. But I think I'll tell a little bit of a story in terms of doing the qualitative work that I did as part of my dissertation when I was at the University of Illinois. So, for me, it was as for many individuals being in graduate school, it's a journey, and I believe wholeheartedly that I wanted to do some sort of qualitative study as part of my own dissertation and thesis work. And because of kind of my athletic background and just kind of the intersections of multiple identities that I have, being a woman of color, being disabled, I'm also adopted, all of these different pieces, I initially wanted to tell the story of other women with disabilities and how they became role models within their own culture and so forth. And it was actually my own committee that kind of took the brakes on that idea. And by putting the brakes on the idea, I mean, this was like a pretty well thought out plan. I actually had already gotten approval from the Institutional Review Board. I already had developed interview protocols. I had identified the particular women that I was hoping to interview. And so, I mean, I was like really gung-ho down this path. And it was members of my committee that said, whoa, 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 why are you going to tell other people's stories instead of first telling your own? And that was for me, that was a really pivotal moment, because I, in my naive graduate student sense, I didn't realize that telling my own story could be like, that could count, you know, if you will, in terms of a thesis, and like that would be rigorous enough, and like, and all of these different things that we think a thesis or a dissertation is supposed to be. I was really confused initially, not understanding enough about kind of this field of interpretive methods and this field of autoethnography, which is on like the more extreme end, if you will, of the qualitative spectrum. And so I was really grateful to my committee that they pushed me to really think about, to think more broadly about what my contribution could be and so forth. But it was not an easy thing for them to convince me to do this. I was very resistant to the idea, and my committee knows this. They kept having to, you know, try to convince me and so forth. But then it also led to, in addition to my own self-doubt about, is this a legitimate way of doing a thesis or a way of doing a study? It also then exposed barriers from a systematic standpoint of how was I going to get my own university to see the value in a study like that. And so I'm proud to say that it was through that journey that we actually changed the precedent at the entire University of Illinois campus, so that now all students, whether that's master's level or PhD level or EDD level, that doing an autoethnography or the telling of your own story can now count as a thesis and as a dissertation project. And so it was precedent setting in that way, and that kind of that battle and that kind of advocacy has now gone on to serve as precedent at many other universities around the world, actually, which has been, you know, something that I never would have thought about, you know, being a graduate student. I didn't always realize just like how big our impact really can be. You get so caught up in sort of your own, what's the word I'm looking for? Like your own milestones, your own kind of tasks that are at hand in order to complete a degree. That was, for me, that was a pretty remarkable piece. You know, and Raul and I, Dr. Moore and I, we go to the International Congress of Qualitative Inquiry every May. And it's been through these subsequent years of going back there where people that I haven't met in person will come up to me and be like, oh my goodness, like, thank you for what you did. It led me to be able to do this work on my own campus or at my own university. And like I said, I never would have thought about those kind of ripples and just how far reaching that all has been. So that's kind of the Cliff Note version of a little bit of kind of my story of kind of that dissertation process and kind of being pushed by my committee and so forth. And then I guess the other thing that I'll say is, now kind of fast forwarding to being on the professor side of things, in terms of what my approach has been in terms of helping students, many very similar to yourselves, in terms of making those decisions of, you know, do I want to do something quantitatively or do I want to do something qualitatively? One of the biggest things that Dr. Moore and I talk about is this misnomer that many students feel that doing qualitative research is somehow easier than quantitative. And I want to just like squash that one right from the start, and just say that yeah, you know, quantitative, there's numbers involved, which you don't necessarily have numbers involved in qualitative work. But one of the fundamental differences to me is that with most quantitative methods, there's a set formula, there's a distinct beginning and an end to, you know, to your data analysis phase. Whereas with qualitative work, you quite literally end up can end up drowning in the data and having to sort of wade through those muddy waters in terms of figuring out what your approach is going to be, what we mean by having reached a saturation point, or getting the most from those interviews or those observations or the ethnographic experience. And so there's not a singular recipe to do qualitative analysis or to do a qualitative study. And I think that that's actually what makes it harder. But harder is not necessarily makes it a bad thing. It just makes it different. Yeah, so those are kind of some preliminary thoughts. Any questions or comments on that?
Anybody wants to jump in? Don't be shy, seriously. Okay, while they're thinking, Anjali, because there is one question that keeps popping up in some of the students' work. You probably said this. It's that word, that I word, the impact. And I think that, yeah, sometimes it's okay. And I feel really concerned that sometimes impact, it's like, oh, I have to do an intervention.
Right.
I have to do field work, and sometimes and I have to start innovating right now. And sometimes I don't realize that impact of a research study could be just helping us understand what the problem really looks like.
Yes, yeah. And you know, I think of impact in qualitative research, you know, as being different again from quantitative in that you're intentionally not trying to quantify that impact in qualitative work, but what you're doing is you're telling the untold stories, or you're telling you're exploring a particular phenomenon in a way that has not been studied before, or in a population that hasn't been looked at before. And one of the really important things to remember about qualitative work is that the goal never is to generalize that, or to, you know, have that sort of national impact that you know, oftentimes people look for from these quantitative studies. But at the same time, that does not mean that your study does not have an impact, because the impact that study may have for even just one individual is amazing. So another example of this, I was doing let me back this story up. One of the pieces of my own identity as an athlete, and now a retired athlete competing on the international level, is also helping countries to develop Paralympic sport programs. And so I've been engaged in this work in Bermuda, Ghana, Zambia, and India in particular. And so as I've been doing this type of work in terms of these service learning type trips and working with coaches and athletes on the ground in these countries, one of the other pieces that I did was design a qualitative study, a case study, to capture the experiences and that impact, as Dr. Mora is talking about, the impact of participation in disability sport for these individuals. And you know, to this day, I'm still really struck by this one particular, again, one singular case of this woman who is from Accra, Ghana, and until she got involved in sport, she was not allowed to go to school, was not allowed to get a job, was not allowed to do all these different things because of being a woman with a disability. But when she got involved with sport and was actually really good at it, and she started winning medals for her country and getting media attention and actually bringing in prize money and things like that to her family, the impact that this experience had on her, and in her own words, she said, "Now my family talks to me." I mean, to me, that, like, holy my goodness, like, that is impact. Even though that's an impact of one, right? but the fact that her family and her community, and she now has that connection, to me, that's better than any type of, national study or whatever that you could do in terms of impact. Yeah. Great question.
No, and I really like that. I really like the idea. And also, as you were talking, I was always thinking of this, the classic story of the starfish.
Mm-hmm.
The time of the guy walking on the beach throwing starfish to the sea. And all that said, oh, you're going to change the world. I mean, it wouldn't matter. It will matter if the larger now, but it will matter to this one if it tosses the starfish back into the sea. And sometimes doing qualitative research is not trying to make a difference to every starfish, but to the ones I can find in my path. And because I think sometimes, and we know this because we're grad students, and as professors, sometimes we're thinking, okay, how big or how far will my research go? Mm-hmm. And sometimes we don't know. And I think the one lesson I would like the students to get today is, the study can be small scale. It doesn't mean it's not going to matter, or it doesn't mean it's not going to be big. Because I think I would say the impact and the scope of a study doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the size of the research design.
Exactly, and I think something that I tell my students as well is that I'm more interested in the depth that you're going to get from talking with individuals or immersing within different cultures. I'm more interested in the depth of that information than I am the numbers of people that you're interviewing, right? And that's a hard thing, and I get that, because when you're in classes like this and so forth, and just being a graduate student, we often put this expectation on ourselves that it has to be this big, this big grandiose study, with I don't know, like 1,000 participants or whatever. And I mean, I'll be honest with you, I'm coding right now some data from a study that was it's actually only 17 students from a particular school that were a part of this social emotional learning program. And it was a weekly intervention. So we have interviews, 9 weeks worth of interviews from just 17 students. Well, 17 seems like a really small number, but by the time you add nine weeks of interviews for all 17 of those students, like, oh my gosh, like it's a lot of data. And all of a sudden, like that number, the number of 17 doesn't really matter, because you have so many data points and so much richness in terms of these stories. And then another example of this is one of my students who's finishing up her master's thesis right now. She is looking at rather the impact of the American election in terms of Donald Trump on immigrant and refugee youth that are in school. So looking at, from the youth perspective, how has this rhetoric been affecting their own social emotional learning and development, and what are their fears and so forth. And with a topic such as that, it was really challenging to get, not just to get approval to do the study, but also to get individuals to sign up to be a part of this, right? And part of that was because with consent forms, you have to provide your name, and many of these individuals are undocumented, and so there was a risk involved to participating in her study. And so she ended up with 4 participants, and she kept coming to me being like, is this enough? Is this enough? And I just kept telling her, absolutely it's enough. Like there's not a set number. And every single one of the times that she sat down with those students, it ended up being over a 4-hour long conversation, and the richness of that data. I mean, she's the harder part she's having right now is, how do I decide what goes into my thesis versus what's going to be a separate paper down the line? Because she ended up with so much wonderful, rich data just from 4 participants.
Anjali, I have 2 questions, but one, because after you said, one is very, very technical.
Yep.
So, but in probably the students are going to be at a loss, because I'm going to ask you about IRB. So this particular project, in what risk level was it classified? Medium risk or high risk?
So it's a challenging question because it started off as a higher risk, and that was because we were originally trying to use schools as the partner and as the recruitment mechanism. But then in Nashville, you also have to get school level approval in addition to university approval in order to do that type of work. And we originally had a partner in the schools that was really gung-ho and it was going to happen. And then we had leadership changeovers. And so we ended up with a new superintendent and a new school board. And we were basically told there's no way this type of study is going to fly. So we then had to go back to the drawing board. My student had to go back to the drawing board with me. And we ended up redoing everything using youth community organizations as the partner. And so as the conduit. So then that ended up being, in terms of our classification, ended up being a lower risk in terms of actual study, but it still went to full review. So it still went to a full review panel because it was youth and because some of the youth were undocumented who were a part of the study, and so they felt they needed those extra protections.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see why. I mean, definitely, yeah. I can see why you had to do a campus review. Yeah, I mean, I'll tell them a little bit more after the talk. I'll elaborate on this. Again, I'd say it was a super technical question. I'll explain what this whole meant because for some of you that was like, but it makes sense. But now I'm going to get into a more down to earth question. Right? This is one more for me and not my own curiosity. But right now, everybody is trying to figure out what the research problem is going to look like. So the question I have is, I would like you to walk us through your own process of figuring out how you end up studying the topic. Like, how you end up saying, oh, this is a topic I should develop a study about, research study for. Walk us through the mental process itself. I mean, where do you begin?
Yeah. So, and I'll be honest, I don't think that there's any one single right answer to this. I think that for me, a lot of it is as I'm, reading different articles and chapters, like what are the things and the topics that I'm reading about that I get really immersed in, that I really, like, I find myself highlighting a lot or writing a lot of notes or coming up with questions in my head. Like, what are the things that really, that speak to me in some way? And that's one way that you can think about, oh, gee, like there might be something here for me to explore further, and so forth. I also think too, as you move throughout your career and you have a chance, after this first project that you do, should you decide to continue as a researcher, I also think as you are doing particular projects, sometimes you think of other questions or other kind of spin-offs that may be tangentially related to what it is you're studying. But I would say, like, write that down in a notebook, have a list, in a Word document, somewhere on your computer, because, like, save those things for later. Because one of the common pitfalls that I do see with students is starting down one path and then feeling like you're moving around topics, too much or something like that, because you get so excited about so many different things. And so one of my kind of, I guess, like my advice there is, once you settle on what it is you want to study and you have your research questions, try to think of that as sort of the fence that you're building. And so, like, those are your boundaries for what your study is going to be for right now. It's not to say that you can't study these other things in the future, but, like, keep that list and, like, revisit it later, add to it, constantly revisit it. I have a running list that I've had for a couple years now. And then if you're going on in terms of research as a part of your career, as you meet other people that might have expertise in some of those other areas, like, that's where other collaborations can come from, and you can then pick up some of those other ideas that you might have to put on the back burner in the immediate here and now.
Folks, I'm tired of asking questions. If anybody wants to come forward and start doing this, I mean, Anjali and I will talk a lot. So I mean, I don't need to come here and commandeer. Yeah, just get close. Yeah, so get a little closer so she can get the microphone. And folks, when you are writing the questions, speak up. Don't be shy. Go ahead.
All right, so you're saying, you were explaining or talking about the cases where you have a lot of ideas. Why if the opposite is happening? What if you don't have any really good idea of what you want to do?
No, that's a great question, and I love your honesty. So another way of thinking of this is it's taking a step totally outside of the research process, like altogether, and asking yourself, like, what am I as a person passionate about? Like, what are the issues that matter most to me? What are the things that I'm curious about? So one exercise, if you're a movie buff, you can do it in relation to movies. If you're like really into books or literature, you can do it in relation to books and literature. But jotting down, like, what are your 3 like favorite movies or books, like, and not just like, oh, I love Green Eggs and Ham because it's so fun, but like, what are the books or the movies that really speak to you in terms of like motivating you, stimulating your brain? So like for me, To Kill a Mockingbird is one of those. The Princess and the Frog is another one of those. And when I take that step back to think about, okay, so once you generate that list of books or movies that does that for you, then it's taking a step back and doing a little mini analysis of what are the common threads, like what is it that connects these things that that really speaks to me as a person. And so for me, it's like the underdog story, right? And like fighting for rights and equality and opportunity and dreams. And so that's to me, that then translated to studying individuals' identity development. And I know it sounds crazy that that you start with like movies and books and things like that, but it's like, what are those things that really motivate you?
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Come on. Come on over here. Yeah, so you can see you and then we can practice.
Okay, first, thank you for being with us, and I think you have an insightful recommendations are going to help us a lot. My question, I'm going to be unpractical because I'm not to move forward. My question is how a researcher can deal with biases when they are, for example, analyzing the data collection, the data that.
Yeah, so great question. Yep. So great question. So first and foremost, with qualitative work, like qualitative work as a paradigm is inherently biased, and that's okay. And I know that like might not sit well with some of you, based on what you may have been told in other classes and things like that. But by its definition, like, you are a part of the research process with qualitative work. And so, but at the same time, your own identities and what you bring to the table are what also contributes to the legitimacy and the depth of understanding and the depth of the analysis that you're able to do by bringing those identities and that bias, as you talk about, to the work that you're doing. So for example, for me, when I'm studying disability identity development, I have a very visible disability. And some people might look at that and be like, oh, well, then your work is biased, right? But for me, I flip that around and say, okay, sure, I'm going to acknowledge that piece of my identity. So you work on what's called a positionality statement. So you talk about that identity, that bias, and how is that helping to get you to a deeper level of understanding with the research that you're doing. So in my case, having a disability, sometimes I have participants who will say throughout the an interview, oh, well, you know what I mean, like meaning that because we have that shared identity and they see me as disabled, they're like, oh, you know what I mean. And so then they stop sharing further information. So something that I then say to that is, well, I think I know what you mean, but could you give me an example? And so then I'm naming that and still allowing them to share in their own words, what it is that they're, that they're thinking about in terms of disability identity. But what I've also found is that very positionality and that so-called bias actually means that I'm able to build trust and rapport much quicker with my participants, and they'll go to much deeper levels of conversation because I'm not the non-disabled, or I'm not the stereotypical white male researcher coming in trying to colonize. Like I'm one of them, and so it actually levels the playing field and gets you to that deeper depth that you're able to honor that story and in terms of how it's being told.
Anybody else? Well, this is a good time to...
I have 3 questions.
Okay, but can you, are you asking me or are you asking Anjali?
Can you hear me? Yeah? Huh? Can you hear me?
Can you hear her?
Maybe.
What's that? Sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, I have 3 questions.
Uh-huh.
Like, how do I know that my first question doesn't have a prejudice or must be neutral? Yeah.
So I would say, and Dr. Moore, you can chime in on this one too. I would say that your questions probably do have prejudice and probably aren't going to be neutral, because that's getting you to the challenging questions that we want to answer. So for example, when I'm doing a study right now with youth and about their own disability identity and how it is that they're making meaning around their disability, and so my question is, how are youth making meaning around their disability? And some people might say, oh, but that assumes that they are. And I'm saying, yes, that is my assumption. Like so I'm owning that assumption, and I'm owning that framing of the question by saying, yes, and here's why. Because of all of this literature that is out there, we know that this is an okay assumption to make. And so going from that as the premise, here's what the question is that I want to study. That would be my end. Dr. Moran, do you have anything to add to that one?
Actually, I agree that it's not a good idea to say, and you can literally write like this: this study operates from the assumption that blah, blah, blah. I mean, you can name your assumptions at the table. I mean, in the sense of, like, I'll say, for example, a researcher in the city who say, okay, we operate from the assumption that the idea that the city is monolingual is not true. We're saying that the city already has me. We're not saying we are bilingual. We're saying there is language. There are languages. We just do not have many. But we always begin by saying, these are my assumptions. There is nothing and laying them on the table can actually make the question stronger.
Yeah. And just to add to that, and like I would ground those assumptions in literature and studies that other people have done and so forth. So you're not just like pulling assumptions out of thin air, but that you're grounding it in, like, gee, okay, because we've seen this being studied in this population and this was the finding and this and so forth, I'm now operating from this being my fundamental assumption. That said, here's what I'm asking.
Well,
does that help?
Yeah. Okay, the other question is, I had the question, and I had like concepts. I started to do the annotated bibliography, and I found that there are many other concepts for similar things. For example, I started with fluency, but then I discovered that it exists communicative competence or language skills, oral proficiency. And how do I know which is the best concept to use?
Yeah. And so I think something that's a really helpful exercise is thinking about a conceptual framework. So once you have your research questions, even if they're tentative, so what it sounds like is like you had kind of these tentative questions, and then you went to do an annotated bibliography to see kind of what was out there in terms of what's being said about these areas of language. And what I would recommend is thinking about, okay, so from that exploration, you came up with fluency, proficiency, like you came up with these different areas, but then outlining like, okay, so what did I find there? What did I find in this bucket? What did I find in this bucket? And then the next part of the question, which is the harder part, how then, from those just 3 buckets for sake of example, how then do each of those, if they all do or if they don't, connect to my original fundamental research question? So what you then it's like building a map kind of backwards, right? So it's like you're starting with kind of what you're seeing in that literature, and then saying, where can I draw those lines to my research question? So you might find that, say, for example, this piece on fluency, again, just as an example, might not really be exactly what my research question is about. So that was really a helpful exercise to see that, you know, these are what scholars are saying about fluency in this population, but that's not really relevant to what my question is. So I'm going to table those, and I'm not going to go down that path. So like that's kind of that's one of kind of my approaches to that kind of work, because it's easy. And even for myself, I mean, and I find myself doing this all the time, particularly when I write introductions to articles, like where the introduction is kind of that literature review, right? It's very easy to be like, oh my gosh, I think I need to go down this path. And oh, if I go down this path, then I need to research this. And oh, if I do that, then I need to look at this. And then before you know it, you have 12 pages worth of, you know, all these different things. And not all of that is necessarily fundamentally related to what your topic is at hand. And one of Dr. Moore's colleagues and I, you know, she tells me this all the time in my writing. So Dr. Dorothy Espelage, she recently was reading a paper that she and I wrote together, and her criticism to me was, why are you just getting to the point of your study on page 6? Like she was like, I don't see how all of this is connected. And so, you know, even for me as an assistant professor that's been doing this for a number of years, I still get that exact same criticism of the question that you're asking. So I don't want this to seem like that it's an easy thing. Like I said, like I still struggle with it myself.
Yeah, we have to like 2 things. Number one, that is exactly what I tell them. So again, I mean, literally, it is an Illinois thing. But aside from that, it's the idea that the sooner you get to center your problem, the quicker you can get to centering your problem, the easier it's going to be to start developing and unveiling and unpacking everything else. And that's why sometimes I'm so insistent, no, don't go fast 5 pages, don't go fast 2 pages, because centering your topic quickly is the key to really being able to unpack everything else and actually make it sound like it's a research project.
Yeah. And by centering that problem, like I said earlier, you're then starting to build that fence. You're starting to build those boundaries of what bodies of literature are important for the framing of that problem versus what are the ones that are outside of the boundaries of that fence. They may be tangential. They may be something that, you know, that you could explore further in a different study, but they may not be directly important to what it is you're doing in the here and now.
And you had a third question?
Yeah. And the last question is, well, I want to work with fluency, but I'm not sure how to measure that or how to gets that, you know. So,
Yeah. So I mean, I think part of it is are you looking to measure that quantitatively? Like, so, you know, there are different quantitative measures of fluency, and looking at the number of errors, and like kind of doing a really detailed like a transcript analysis in terms of the actual speech patterns that individuals have. That's a quantitative approach. Or are you looking more from a qualitative perspective of what do individuals think about their own fluency, and how they've kind of gone down that journey, and what is their lived experience around, you know, around this experience of developing fluency or struggling with fluency and things like that. And so part of it depends on what your research question actually is, because if your research question is, you know, is something like, what are the fluency errors in XYZ population, or what are the fluency challenges in XYZ population, that might be by design, by the way you're asking that question, it might be pushing you more towards quantitative measures of that construct. Whereas if you're asking, the framing of your question is, what are the lived experiences around developing fluency, that by the way that question is worded, that lends itself to a qualitative framework in terms of how you would answer the question. So it all depends on how it is you're asking that question, which dictates then the methods that you would use to explore it.
yeah. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem.
Be shy. Another time, be shy. Oh, there you go. We have another question. Coming right up.
Just wait.
We can wait.
Okay. Well, nice to meet you. My name is Eliana. And the question is, I don't know, continue with my research question is worthy. How do you know that your research question is doable or not?
So I think, so part of it is, first of all, I think every question is worthy, the same way that I don't think there's ever a stupid question. That's my own kind of framing and so forth of, and part of that is, I don't think that most of the time, I don't think people are coming up with questions that don't have any type of merit, like in the essence that you're likely asking the question because somebody else hasn't asked that question before, and or hasn't asked it in that way before, right? In terms of whether it's doable or not, that's where conversations with people like Dr. Mora can help you to kind of like to rein it in. So for example, I had a student who was proposing to look at maternal health needs of women who are at risk for HIV, and was wanting to do this study in Kenya. And she had proposed, you know, some beautiful research questions, and it wasn't that her questions were too big or not doable, but when she got into what she was proposing in terms of how she was going to answer them, she was proposing that she was going to interview 500 individuals. And I was like, you are never going to graduate. And I mean it literally, like she literally had 500 in there. And she got to that number thinking about the population in Kenya and like what she was trying to do. And like, but again, she was thinking of it more from a quantitative perspective, but her methods were qualitative. And I said, you are never going to be able to actually do this with that number. So I said, how about we change that number to 20? And I said, even that's ambitious. But that's where somebody with background and expertise and having done studies like Dr. Mora, they're going to be able to help you to kind of to rein that in if it is a little bit too ambitious, or if it's not ambitious enough. Like, so I've also had the opposite of sometimes individuals have said, well, I really am, like, you know, whatever my research question is, I'm really interested in the, you know, perspectives of XYZ and how it affects students and families. And that was in their question. but they were only proposing talking with students. And I said, well, where's the parent component? Where's the family component? Like, because you said you were really interested in how this affects students and their families. And in what it was they were proposing, there was nothing related to their family. And so it can go the other way too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Keep the conga line running.
Good morning. Nice to meet you.
You too.
You're actually well known here. I'm actually working on something that is like a called meta-analysis. But it happened that I was thinking about something, and I've been reading a lot about this is bilingualism. And since I've been reading a lot about it, I have found a lot of information, and it has changed my position towards bilingualism. How do you deal with those kind of things when you're doing this meta-analysis?
So let me just reframe. So you're doing this meta-analysis, and as you've gotten involved in looking at the studies, it sort of changed your question. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I actually at the very beginning I was pretty strict. I was very narrow with my position, but I didn't read any articles. I've been doing literature review, and I found it has changed some of my beliefs towards what I'm doing. And you deal with that because it's like feeling that you need to change everything again.
Sure. So first and foremost, sometimes the things that we learn, like it can and does change our approach and things like that. The other piece though is that sometimes that learning and that takeaway can also be something that what I call, like, you table it and you say, hey, oh my goodness, if I were to redo this again, I would like to do this. Like, this is an area for future research. And so sometimes, depending on how far into a project that you are, you might take that learning, acknowledge that learning, and acknowledge that fundamental shift, but say, yeah, but what I realized is that I needed to finish what I started, but I want to save that piece of the conversation to look at further. Or in the case of a master's thesis, you might tell your committee, like, one of the common questions that we often ask students, hint, hint, is, if you were to do the study again, what would you do differently? And like, there would be your answer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And spoiler alert, even if they don't ask you that question, you can actually bring that up in your thesis.
Yes.
The whole section is called future research.
Yeah.
Future research, I mean, we'll talk about this again in the second semester, but future research is basically kind of saying, you can say, if I were to do this again, I think this is what we need to do. Or you can say, well, if someone else wants to give it a try, this is what we need to do. But that's another way. Even if they don't ask you the question, you can still address it in the document. Don't be shy. But if you have questions already, you can repeat. Yeah, you can go for seconds. I mean, this is like a buffet. You can go. This is a buffet, man. This is like what could a buffet today? All you can ask. It's a buffet, man. Take advantage of it.
Okay, one of the problems that we have when we get into research is looking for something which is innovative. I mean, because, for example, in my case, I'm dealing with assessment, and assessment it's becoming a cliche. So my question is, how can I know that what I'm going to research is really, I mean, in other words, to what extent innovation is really
Innovative.
Yeah, innovative.
Wait, sorry, you were cutting out there a little bit. So your work is related to assessment, and tell me again. Sorry.
Okay, and my current project was to look for something which was really new, but
Yep.
So what I want to know is to what extent innovation is really
It's innovative.
Innovative, yeah.
And what, Raul?
Yeah, so the whole idea that, okay, how do I know that my project is really innovative?
Oh, yeah.
Especially in assessment.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think that part of it is seeing like what is it that other people are saying about the topic at hand and things like that. For my own work, a lot. Hold on, Colton. Yes, you can come through.
Well done. You do it.
A lot of the work that I do is also very new and that people haven't been writing about it. People haven't been researching it, which also is kind of cool because it gives you that latitude to be like, hey, like build that justification as to why this work is so important and show the fact that people have not been researching this. People have not been asking this question or studying it. And so one of the ways that I've done that in some of my own work is I start with a systematic literature review and I show, hey, this is the topic at hand, and can you believe it? There's only, X number of studies that have ever even remotely come a little bit close to studying what it is that I'm looking at. And therefore, that becomes your justification as to why it is that I'm going into this new area and so forth. So you still have, even though it's an understudied area, even though it's a new area and so forth, you still have to provide that justification as to why it's relevant, why it's important, and all of that. And I will also caution you to never, ever, ever say nobody has ever studied this before, because chances are somebody has studied a piece of it, an area of it, and that phrase will get you eaten alive by your committee. But if you go, hey, I systematically look for anything related to, to my exact topic, these are the tangential things that I looked for, and there's limited research that's available. Or maybe it's, hey, people have been really interested in this, and you mentioned assessment, like people are really looking at this at the organizational level or at the assessment level, but it's not in the scholarly literature. So you might be reporting on blogs and organizational reports and white papers, less so than things that you're finding in journals, because you're saying, hey, I didn't find anything in journals, but I found these pieces which help to inform the work that I'm doing.
Let me piggyback on Bernard's question, because I think the question he was asking, there were two parts to it. Yeah. And the first part is, and I think that's the bigger question here is, fine, if I find the innovation part, but what happens when I'm trying to encounter a field that is already saturated, or when apparently it's always more of the same? How do I tackle that?
Mm-hmm. So I think the other piece of that is you find your niche. Like you find, like you're not always going to be doing earth-shattering, groundbreaking, brand new research. But what you might be doing in a saturated field is looking at it from a different theoretical lens, or looking at it in a different population, or thinking of it from a different perspective. And all of those pieces, it's you're adding to this body of what may seem like an already saturated area of work or topic, but you're putting that spin or that flavor on it of what might be missing from what other folks have said about that topic.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, there, another brave soul has mentioned to us a question. There you go.
Okay, nice to meet you.
You too.
Okay, right now my research is about an mnemotechnic technique, which is known as space repetition. But I don't know if qualitative tools are going to be the most recommendable for this kind of research. Which recommendations could you tell me? Because I'm a little bit confused and puzzled about the methodology I'm to use to carry out this research.
Yeah. So I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to working with your advisor in terms of having that conversation of, based on the question that you are asking, what would be the types of methods that fit that and like that can that lend itself to answering that question. I do think that it can end up being very, very field specific. So it sounds like, that's the case with what it is that you're studying. Dr. Mora, do you have anything to add to that one?
Not until I have finally fully read the draft. Because obviously I'm still reading the drafts. But I think it's not going to come down to the question you ask. And it's going to come down, I mean, as Dr. Forber-Pratt mentioned earlier in the presentation, what is it that you want to learn? So you don't necessarily have to go into a quantity just because the topic, just because a topic has traditionally appeared as quantitative in the literature doesn't mean you cannot do qualitative.
Right.
And sometimes all it takes is one study to turn the tide. I recall the work of reading comprehension. Anybody who reads literature or reading comp until 1995, it was everything was quantitative. And then Juan Jimenez, who's now at Vanderbilt with you, he actually, his dissertation basically changed kind of started changing the rules of the game. And more people started looking at qualitative studies as a result of the emergence of Bob's work and other people who are doing qualitative dissertations in reading. Because it was like, oh no, in reading comprehension, you always have to measure, and you always have to quantify it. You have to run statistics, and it's like, well, why don't you just start looking at people instead of looking at tests? So sometimes even a question as simple as, yeah, we're looking at reading tests. Are we looking at readers? Are we looking at the people who read? And when you say, I'm not going to look at the test scores, I'm going to look at the people who read, that changes me. And so it's basically, what would you like to look at? Or who, rather, would you like to look at? And once you have a question in mind, that gives you an idea of which way you want to go.
Because actually I was kind of freaked out because, I'm going to carry this out because I'm not that good at maths. And the studies that I researched were filling up with complicated and panicking mathematics. So I was kind of, I'm going to do this. I like it a lot, but it was kind of challenging because of that focus.
Panicky students. How do you deal with that?
Find another advisor.
Well, no, but in general, no. A serious question about when your students are panicking.
Yeah.
How do you and they manage that? Tell us stories. I know how to handle advisors when they panic. I want to hear what other advisors do.
Yeah. I think really it's finding individuals who can help to round out and to provide you with that support, that would be needed to carry out that work. And as advisors, I think that we recognize our own limitations in terms of, if things are going down a different direction. I've had that conversation with students. It's like, hey, it's not that your questions are bad or that, or that your study is bad. It's just that I'm not the right person to to be able to provide you with that methodological expertise or with that content expertise. So for example, with the student that I was saying who was doing the study with immigrant and refugee students and undocumented students, that's not a population that I study, but I study marginalized communities. I knew the methodologies of doing interviews and all of that piece, but we had to find somebody else who could help us from a content side of things in order to round out the work that she was doing.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
It's not a time to be shy. If you have a question, there you go.
Okay, hello, nice to meet you.
You too.
My concern or my question right now is about when you have your idea, you have talked about many things that are important, like being passionate about it, etc. I feel right now that I'm very connected to the topic that I want to work with. I'm really passionate about it, but my topic is about LGBT material in high school. But right now I'm thinking that I got the idea, I got the passion, But so far I have found that probably is going to be a problem in the future when you need to talk about concerns from the parents, from the school. Actually, this week I talked to the coordinator and the principal, and they opened their eyes when I talked about the topic that I want to use in the school. He was like, "Are you sure that you want to talk about that?" It's like, so I felt that they were not very happy with that decision. And right now I'm thinking about, for example, what are the parents are going to say? What are the other teachers? I know that I want to do it, and I know that I'm not going to change it just because of that. But I know that it's going to be like a big struggle and a big problem. So how to face those situations, how to manage the situation that probably your research depends on others, and rather they're not going to be happy with that.
Absolutely, great question. So I mean, this is really where the research really, it meets the political, and by that I mean you're running into having to navigate different systems in order to do the work that you're passionate about and that you want to do. And doing school-based research in particular is very messy. I mean, it's messy for all of those reasons that you talked about, especially with young people. You're having to work with parents as well as district administrators and principals and things like that. My best advice is you need to find someone that is an ally from within who can advocate for you and help you to understand the best way to frame that for that particular school, if that's where it is that you're wanting to do the study. You know, when I think about one of my students who was actually doing something very similar, which was she was wanting to find out from, it was a high school, what the social emotional learning needs were of students who identified as LGBTQ, but the school like did not want that to be the topic, right? And so she had to be a little bit creative in terms of how she did that, but thankfully she had an ally from within the building who was like, hey, let's put together a lunch bunch group where it wasn't advertised as being an LGBT lunch get together, but it was advertised, and then and then this ally was able to identify students who they thought would benefit from this you know, the study, saying, hey, this is what it's about, but they had to be very, very particular in terms of how it was that they marketed it and everything like that. But the only way that was possible was to have an ally from within, because you also don't want to like make people mad, right? And to go off and do something that jeopardizes that relationship. The other example is like I shared with my other student, where if you run into so much resistance at the school level, it may be that you have to think about coming at it, still doing the same study and with the same types of individuals, but using community-based organizations as the recruitment mechanism. So after school programs, things that and so with that particular student, because of that resistance she was facing, none of her interviews could actually take place on school property. So that also led to some other challenges of, okay, so where are we going to meet? How are the students going to get there? You know, all of these different things. But it was a couple after school programs that said, oh, but they're here for our after school activities, so you can come in on every Tuesday afternoon, or whatever it ended up being. And so you may have to think creatively in terms of how you reach that end goal.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, Mark. Yeah, there you go. 2 more questions. There you go.
Okay. Thank you for sharing with us. Okay, we want to work on literacy centers or learning centers. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So we want to know what kind of aspects do we have to take into account? Do we want to implement that methodology or approach here with our students? And we have been searching literature about it, and so it's from long time ago, but they are good resources. But we want to know about these aspects that we need to take into consideration here. Because we know that it's with small groups, and here in public schools we have so large groups. But we want to know with them.
So you're looking for specific assessments to look at, like the learning communities, or I'm sorry, I'm not quite following.
Okay, we want to know, we want to work with our students about reading comprehension, right? About how to pass from literal to inferential, right, level, but doing through learning centers, okay? Like that is strategy that we have small groups into the classrooms, and with the activities that they are going to develop is about reading, okay? So we want to know what kind of aspects do we have to take into account in our context, in our public schools, because when I was in the United States, I worked with the learning centers, and I really like this kind of work with the students. But there we have other resources, right? Yep. So here we maybe don't have these kind of resources. But, and there we have less students than here. And so I don't know, or can we tell us about this, the learning?
Yes, I think I would think about the number of different learning sectors or like the smaller groups that you're going to do in terms of what are the things that you can do to try to have as much continuity across what those groups are doing. So you might have an implementation log, for example, where you're trying to make sure that each of those smaller groups is as similar to one another as you can, in order to then in order to assess like whether that's the effectiveness of them or the impact of that, or what that experience is. So one of the easy things to do in that type of situation is to think about, okay, so what are the factors that I can control? What are the pieces that we can try to have some uniformity across what that what those small group conversations are gonna look like?
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So what has to do with action research? Dr. Mara was saying us that just because we're teachers and we involve our students in our research does not mean that we're doing action research, right?
Mm-hmm.
That involve activism, actually making an impact in our society, actually like going beyond. So I wanted to ask, what are your thoughts on the action research at a master's level? Is it advice or something?
Yeah, so I mean I think one of the biggest things is thinking about based on the topic that you're doing, like how are you going to recruit those individuals? And you're right, like not everyone is going to want to be a part of a study, and just because just because something might be convenient doesn't necessarily mean that that's gonna that's gonna fit in terms of the methodology and that you're gonna get the results that you're looking for. I think that one of the other challenges is that student projects are time sensitive, right? In terms of you're bound by semesters and milestones and trying to get projects accomplished. And one of the things with action research is that oftentimes there's not those definitive time boundaries, and so it's more common that things take a lot more time and aren't gonna, it's messier, is I guess what I'm trying to say, is like it's very messy in that there's not a definitive start or an end to that work. And so that's going to be where having communications and really setting that boundary and that fence that we've been talking about, particularly with your advisor, is going to be really, really important, because what you don't want is to take on a project that you don't even know when it's going to end, right? I mean, because that's not going to help you in terms of your own milestones. But it's like that the challenge with that is it's really, really, really context dependent, and it's going to take somebody who is familiar with that context that you're looking at, to be able to help you to kind of fine tune and to weigh in terms of what those boundaries could or should be, in order to make sure that, and back to another question that came up, like to make sure that the project is in fact doable and able to be achieved.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, go for it, go for it.
One thing that I noticed is that, well, we tend to look for problems all the time, and so things tend to be a little bit negative. Like we're always looking for what's wrong in education or linguistics or anything we're interested in doing research on. How can we like look at things from a more positive approach and just looking for what's wrong and me trying to solve it through research, but like from a more positive view?
Yeah, so I would highly recommend looking at some stuff from the discipline of positive psychology, and so that whole discipline, it's really about rejecting that deficit-based model that you're talking about. And so instead of asking what's wrong, you're saying, hey, what's going right? And qualitative research is actually really great at that, because you're able to frame your research question from a strengths-based perspective of saying, hey, what are the strengths that these students are bringing to this issue or to the table on this topic or whatever, and you're able to then capture, say, from a case study or from an interview or from observations in the classroom, you're able to then reframe that as, hey, I'm here, instead of like many, and here in the US this happens too, instead of having a checklist and a clipboard where you're looking for the bad student behaviors or the disruptions in the class, you create that checklist where you're looking for the positives, you're looking for the positive reframes, you're looking for the really engaged students, you're looking for the successes. And so you are in control as the researcher in terms of what that checklist, could look like. And so you can make that be a positive.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, great question.
Hello, I want to ask for an advice in how can I conduct my research with reflexivity without being subjective? Like, how can I get away from the subjectivity when I'm interpreting or analyzing a test or a specific practice? Because that's like a big problem or difficult thing that I have when I'm analyzing or reading tests. I feel that I'm so subjective about what I found.
Yeah, so I mean, so if you're analyzing a test from a qualitative standpoint in terms of, is this test applicable to this population, or what are the shortcomings of this test for for linguistic reasons, like are the items culturally responsive and and linguistically responsive and so forth, like to me that alone is going to be subjective, and so you really can't answer those types of questions in an objective way. The only way that you're going to really be able to do that objectively, which I don't recommend doing as students, is if you're going to create your own measure that is objective in nature and so forth, and to do really good measurement development and to develop rigorous assessments and so forth that have that level of objectivity. It takes a very, very, very long time. I'm in the process of developing a quantitative measure on disability identity development, and I'll be honest with you, I've been doing it hardcore for the past 4 years, but I started this work when I was in graduate school, so this has been an 8-year-long project. So that is beyond the scope of being a master's student. So I would not recommend trying to go down the assessment development path as a master's student.
Yeah, but let me play with Natalia. Let me play with Natalia's question for a moment.
Okay.
Because I'm starting to wonder if sometimes we are confusing objectivity with detachment.
Yeah.
In the sense that sometimes we need to detach ourselves a little bit, kind of play with the epic and the etic, if you will, in the research. Kind of play with the tension of being too close to the subject and I need to take a little bit of distance to walk through this objectivity. And if we are really saying, oh, we need to be objective, what we have to say is maybe be a little more detached, because, I mean, qualitative research is subjective. I always remember that famous talk in the way Tom Schwant always explained it. No, I mean, there's no objectivity because you are doing everything. Once you are doing everything, it's subjective because there's a subject involved in the process. So to what extent, what Nati might need to do is find ways to detach herself from the subject or from the topic at hand, as opposed to strive for the so-called objectivity. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really similar to what I'm saying in that it's I guess I personally don't feel like that there really is true objectivity, and that's my own framing. You know, and I mean this even in some of the most rigorous quantitative studies that you could read and that are out there. One of my favorite professors, actually, going through graduate school, anytime we read an article, he made us look up who those authors were. And like who are, like, what is their gender, what is their nationality, their race, like where are they coming from? Because his point was that even in most rigorous, supposedly objective studies, there is an element of subjectivity in terms of who that author is. And I think that that's a really important piece in that you're never truly detached.
Thank you.
All right, it's almost 12:30, so one last question. Is it one last question?
I have a question.
Go on.
Can I get from you?
No, because the microphone, because we need to be, because the microphone webcast, we want to make sure she can hear you.
Okay, hi. First of all, thank you for sharing your knowledge with us. And my question is about form, because I have been doing my research about ICT and the teaching of English and a lot of things. But I want to ask you, which word is used to refer to the teaching of a second language in another subject? And for example, history in English or math in English, what is the right word to? I was looking at it like mainstreaming, but I don't know if it's exactly what I wanted to say.
Wait, sorry, you were cutting out there. Can you repeat it? Sorry.
No problem. Again, which word, I'm asking about form, okay? Which word is used to refer to the teaching of a second language in another subject? Like history in English, math in English, what is the word? Because in Spanish it's like transversalizar, but I don't know what is the word in English.
Yeah. So I mean, I think, and it's actually, I really like this question because I'm doing some work right now with a doctoral student where we're really unpacking a lot of pieces of what happens when there isn't a direct translation of certain words, and what happens when there isn't a you know, like a clean way of you know, the form of that particular word in another language. But then if that's the case, how then can we talk about that nuance and talk about that difference in the work that we're doing? And something that's been really interesting from the work that she's doing with this is like, it's part of it is naming that. So part of it is, and sometimes the best papers actually start with questions that we're grappling with, like questions that we may not have an answer to. So like your question could be the start of like a section in a paper, right? Being like, hey, like this is what I'm really struggling with, of like, what is, you know, what are the shortcomings of this? What do we do with this paradox, if you will, in terms of looking at this? Dr. Moore, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, yeah. Well, first of all, that word mainstreaming, that is a word that I would, knowing, I mean, like especially knowing, I mean, having dealt with that in the US in particular, it's a word I would stay away from. Because the mainstreaming is mostly pulling students out of an environment where they have scaffolding and just throwing it into the walls. Basically, mainstreaming is taking ESL students into language arts. And that's it. So mainstreaming is actually taking away the support structure that some students need and throwing them into a regular track, expecting to perform like everybody else just because we moved you. And in fact, I even problematized in an article in 2004, I problematized the situation with ESL students that there is no honors track. That even in the school curriculum in the US, ESL students don't have, there's no AP ESL, there's no advanced placement English for ESL students. Advanced AP English is language arts, just going to the language arts class.
But I have another question about it. What if I will study about it? If I want to teach another subject, like math, in English, for example, teach the numbers like 2 + 2 is equals 4, etc. But we are in math class. I'm talking about elementary school. So what word can I use to say that I'm doing that? I don't know. I'm not even confused about it.
I think, yeah, I mean, definitely we can talk more because that is, I mean, about the terminology.
Exactly, because I'm.
But I think that we can kind of, I would like to hear your take on this. I mean, when you start looking, and maybe this happened to you, this happened to me too, that you start shopping for theory, so to speak. And you start finding that there are 5 or 6 or 7 related terms. How do we choose one when all of them look so appealing? What is your approach in that regard?
I mean, I actually think that you don't have to choose one. I think that it's more that you're taking the pieces from multiple theories that are informing your work, and then you're building that hodgepodge, you're building that structure as to what from each of these theories you're using to support the lens through which you're doing your study.
Thank you very much.
All right, so we're gonna stop here because it's 12:30, and I think I have already taken too much of that Anjali for an hour and a half. No, I mean, and we're friends and all that, but I mean, I cannot be abusive. So, but the first thing is, thank you. I think we should give her a hand. Thank you, Anjali, for sharing with these students what I get to enjoy on an almost daily basis.
Yeah, well, thank you.
We get a lot of WhatsApp, and a lot of it is this, kind of like ranting and sharing thoughts and throwing each other questions. I have things that happen to me, like throw questions to her, like, okay, what do you think? And then she's like, yeah, I have this thing, throw a question, and we just keep going. And sometimes I'm walking down the stairs and I get a message and I have to be careful not to trip because I'm trying to answer the question quickly, stuff like that. So I'm just glad that we got to interact with Anjali, who's an incredibly bright scholar and really great researcher. Get some ideas on how to give the research forward. We're gonna record this and hopefully because I'll keep it as a reference for those of you who. Yeah. And so again, thank you from all my heart. I really appreciated the time. Obviously, we'll see each other next week at the ARA, and that's gonna be a lot of fun. I can't wait to see you. I can't wait to see the King.
Yeah.
It's been a year, so I missed the King. So I look forward to seeing you all. And thank you again. Thank you for the time.
Yeah, thank you to you all for your wonderful questions and really great conversation. And I look forward to seeing you this week. Bye.